She wanted to ruin my wedding so badly, she dialed 911. But what she didn't know was that the bride she was reporting was a police chief of this very town. Most brides fear rain clouds, missing flowers, or a late groom. But I feared something much darker. Not because I doubted my love, not because I wasn't ready to walk down the aisle, but because I lived across from the one neighbor who turned joy into chaos, order into misery, and peace into war. Her name was Karen, and she was the queen of our homeowners association. Karen was more than just a neighbor. She was an obsession. She obsessed over lawns, trash cans, mailboxes, and paint colors. She obsessed over cars parked 1 inch too far from a curb. And most of all, she obsessed over control. The HOA was her empire, and every house in the neighborhood was a kingdom she believed she ruled. She wasn't elected. She wasn't chosen. She simply inserted herself into power, barking orders, filing complaints, and threatening fines until people gave up fighting back. Most did, but not me. So when I announced I was having my wedding in my backyard, Karen didn't see it as a celebration. She saw it as an act of rebellion. She saw it as a direct challenge to her throne. The first sign came as a letter, handwritten, sharp, and dripping with hostility. Unauthorized gatherings of more than 20 people will not be tolerated. Days later, another arrived. Weddings are not permitted on HOA property without prior approval. Then another. Any excessive noise or traffic will result in immediate fines. The notes weren't just about rules. They were warnings, thinly veiled threats. And I knew exactly who was behind them. Still, I ignored her, because this wasn't about her. This was about me, my future husband, my family, and my vows. I wanted a backyard wedding for a reason. I wanted simplicity, intimacy, and the comfort of celebrating at home. I thought, why should a neighbor have the power to steal that from me? But Karen wasn't the type to give up. In the weeks leading to the wedding, she escalated. Delivery trucks dropping off chairs and decorations? She photographed them, shaking her head as though evidence was building for a trial. My cousins practicing music in the yard? She stormed over to measure the decibel levels. Guests parking during the rehearsal dinner? She stalked them with her notepad, scribbling license plates as though she were law enforcement herself. But Karen's pettiness wasn't enough for her. She wanted destruction. She wanted my wedding to collapse under the weight of her interference. Neighbors whispered that she had gone door to door, warning them about illegality, claiming I hadn't filed permits, and threatening anyone who attended. Some even said she was preparing to fine me for unauthorized decorations. And all I could do was laugh at her desperation. Until the morning of the wedding. The sun rose golden that day, casting a warm glow on the neatly arranged chairs in my yard. The flowers were vibrant, the arch was decorated, and everything looked picture perfect. My bridesmaids bustled around with laughter. Children played on the grass, and for a brief moment, the world felt peaceful. But peace doesn't last long in Karen's world. As I slipped into my gown, adjusting the veil and steadying my breath, one of my cousins rushed in with panic in her eyes. Karen wasn't just watching from her window anymore. She wasn't scribbling notes or muttering about rules. She was standing in the middle of the cul-de-sac, phone clutched tightly, anger twisting her face. And she was dialing 911. The audacity of it almost felt surreal. To her, my wedding was an event. It was a crime. To her, laughter was a violation. To her, joy was disorder. And in her mind, the only solution was police intervention. But here's the delicious irony. Karen had no idea who she was calling the police on. She thought she was summoning officers to break up a wedding, to issue citations, maybe even to clear out the yard. She didn't know that the very bride standing under that arch, moments from saying her vows, was the chief of police. Me. In that instant, I realized this day would be remembered not just for love, not just for promises, but for battle. Karen wanted to weaponize the law against me. She wanted flashing lights, sirens, and chaos. But what she didn't realize was that she had just picked a fight with the one person who embodied the law in this town. I didn't panic. I didn't flinch. I breathed deeply, reminding myself that this was still my day. But beneath the calm exterior, a storm brewed. My guests were arriving. My family was smiling. My vows were waiting. But so was the war Karen had declared. because this wasn't just a wedding anymore. It was a showdown, and the stage was my own backyard. The music began to play. Guests turned toward the aisle, and all seemed well. But in the distance, the faint sound of sirens began to echo. The 911 call had gone through, and in that chilling moment, I knew Karen had succeeded in pulling the police into my wedding. The only question was, what would happen when they arrived and realized the bride they were called to confront was their chief? The sound of sirens grew louder, and in that moment I realized my wedding wasn't just under attack. It was about to become a crime scene. Asterisk, asterisk. Guests turned their heads, confusion spreading to the rows of neatly arranged chairs. Some thought maybe an accident had happened nearby. Others whispered nervously, eyes darting toward the cul-de-sac. But I knew the truth. Those sirens weren't passing by. They were coming here, to my wedding. And all because Karen had decided that joy was a violation. The sirens cut to the quiet neighborhood like a blade, shattering the laughter, drowning the music, and forcing every heart to pound faster. A moment that should have been filled with vows and smiles was suddenly hijacked by flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the white tent and delicate flowers. My wedding photographs, forever marked by chaos. Karen stood at the edge of her driveway, her arms crossed smugly, her eyes locked on my backyard like a hunter watching prey. To her, this wasn't just a call to police. It was a victory. She had summoned the law to crush what she believed was disorder, and she was ready to watch it unfold. The first patrol car pulled in, then another. Officers stepped out, cautious but professional, hands resting near their belts as they scanned the scene. To them, this was just another dispatch, a complaint of a large, unauthorized gathering. Noise, disturbance, the kind of call they received weekly in neighborhoods where HOA disputes spiraled out of control. But as they approached the backyard, confusion began to flicker across their faces. They saw flowers, not chaos. They heard music, not violence. They saw families, children, and grandparents, guests in their finest clothes, not lawbreakers. And then their eyes landed on me. There I stood in my wedding gown, veil cascading down, bouquet in hand. But beneath the lace and fabric was a face they all knew, a face they answered to. Their chief. The officers froze. The awkwardness in that moment could have silenced the stadium. They had been called here to enforce the law against their own leader, against the very woman who had trained them, guided them, and led them through crises. They glanced at each other, uncertainty painted across their features. Behind them, Karen's voice could be heard, sharp, commanding, dripping with self-righteousness. She urged them to act, to shut everything down, to do their job. But whose job was it really? Inside, I battled two instincts. The first was to laugh, to expose her absurdity, to let the entire neighborhood see how far she was willing to go just to ruin a wedding. But the second was darker, because while Karen thought she had the power, I knew the truth. I wasn't just another bride in a white dress. I was the highest authority in that moment, and the officers standing there weren't there to follow Karen's orders. They were there to follow mine. Guests whispered nervously, unsure whether they should remain seated or scatter. My family stood frozen, their faces pale, wondering if the wedding was already ruined. The music stopped abruptly, silence weighing heavy on the air. The only sound left was a faint hum of squad cars idling in the street. And then, as if to fuel the fire, Karen marched closer. She wasn't satisfied with the sirens. She wasn't satisfied with the interruption. She wanted a spectacle. She pointed toward the yard, gesturing wildly, demanding the officers remove everyone. In her mind, this was her moment of glory, the HOA finally flexing its power to crush rebellion. But she had miscalculated. Because the more she pushed, the more the officers realized the absurdity of her complaint. They weren't looking at criminals. They were looking at families. They weren't looking at chaos. They were looking at joy. And at the center of it all was their chief, watching calmly as her neighbors spiraled out of control. The irony hung in the air like smoke. The very person Karen thought would save her crusade had become her greatest enemy. And the longer the scene played out, the clearer it became. Karen hadn't just disrupted a wedding. She had declared war against the one person she could never defeat. Still, the damage was done. My wedding wasn't private anymore. Neighbors peeked from windows. Some filmed from porches. The story of sirens at the wedding was already writing itself in real time. And Karen, still desperate, still convinced she could bend reality to her will, wasn't finished yet. Because when she realized the police weren't shutting the ceremony down, she escalated again. She threatened lawsuits. She claimed violations. She shouted about safety hazards and unauthorized gatherings. Her voice cut through the neighborhood, shrill and venomous, as though the louder she became, the truer her lies would sound. My guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to stay or leave. My family looked to me, their chief, their bride, for a decision. And deep down, I knew the truth. Karen wasn't going to stop. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not until she destroyed what she couldn't control. The ceremony could still continue. Love could still be celebrated. But the war had only just begun. Because if Karen could weaponize the HOA against my wedding, what else could she do? What would happen when her lies spread further? When her obsession turned darker? When her power grab grew bolder? The sirens faded. The officers, uncomfortable and torn, stepped back. Guests tried to settle. But the shadow of Karen's rage loomed large. My wedding day wasn't ruined, but wasn't safe either. And as I looked into the eyes of the man I was about to marry, I realized something chilling. This was no longer about a ceremony. This was about survival in a neighborhood ruled by fear. And the real battle with Karen was only just beginning. I thought the sirens were the worst Karen could do to my wedding. But I was wrong. What she did next turned my happiest day into an all-out war. Asterisk, asterisk. Most neighbors would have stopped after embarrassing themselves with a 911 call. Most would have retreated when police officers refused to back their obsession. But not Karen. To her, failure wasn't an option. If the officers wouldn't shut down my wedding, then she would take matters into her own hands. And what she did next was more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. The ceremony had resumed. Guests tried to smile. Music began again, and I walked down the aisle determined to reclaim the joy she had tried to steal. But Karen was still lurking in the background, her phone in one hand, her camera in the other. She wasn't filming memories. She was gathering evidence. And before the vows were even spoken, she launched her final attack. Karen stormed into the cul-de-sac with papers in hand. HOA bylaw sheets she had printed and highlighted, as though she were a judge presiding over a courtroom. She waved them furiously, declaring the wedding illegal, shouting about fire hazards, trespassing, even environmental violations. Her voice carried across the neighborhood, drowning out the music and vows. For a moment, it wasn't a wedding anymore. It was a public spectacle. But Karen wasn't satisfied with words. She demanded power. And when words didn't give her that power, she escalated further. She called city code enforcement animal control, even the fire department, claiming serious safety risks at my backyard ceremony. Within an hour, more vehicles began circling the neighborhood, lights flashing, as though the quiet cul-de-sac had become the site of a major emergency. The guests were terrified. Families began to whisper about leaving. Children cried, watching as uniformed officials surrounded the block. My husband's face was pale, his hands clenched. And all the while, Karen stood proudly at the edge of her driveway, convinced she had won. But what she didn't know was that her war had just exposed her. Because every false call she made, every lie she screamed, every baseless claim she pushed, that was evidence too. Evidence of harassment, evidence of abuse of power, evidence of a neighbor who had crossed far beyond the line of HOA enforcement. And I wasn't just a bride, I was the chief of police. I stepped forward, no longer hiding behind my veil, no longer just a woman in a gown. I faced the officers, the code enforcers, the neighbors with cameras in their hands. And I told them the truth, calmly, powerfully, without fear, the false complaints, the harassment, the weeks of intimidation, the lies, all of it poured out not as anger, but as fact. And slowly, the tide turned. The officers who had once stood uncertain now stood firm. The code enforcers realized there was no violation. The fire department, finding no hazard, packed up their gear. One by one, Karen's reinforcements vanished, leaving her alone. Her face twisted, her voice cracked, but no one was listening anymore. The power she thought she had was gone. The neighborhood watched in silence, some in awe, some in relief. For years, Karen had ruled through fear. But that day, in her desperation to destroy my wedding, she had exposed herself. She wasn't the queen of the HOA. She was just a neighbor consumed by control. The wedding continued, finally free from her shadow. I spoke my vows with strength. My husband smiled through tears, and my family cheered louder than ever. The photos may have flashing lights in the background, but to me, they told a story even more powerful than love. They told a story of resilience. Karen retreated into her house, blinds drawn, her empire of intimidation crumbling around her. And from that day forward, the neighborhood changed. People stopped bowing to her demands. They saw her for what she was, powerless. And though she still lingered in the background, whispering threats and muttering complaints, she never had the same grip again. Because the day she tried to ruin my wedding was the day she ruined her reign. And as I look back now, I don't just see a wedding, I see a battle won. Not just for me, but for every neighbor who had ever felt crushed under the weight of her rules. Karen called 911 to ruin my wedding, but the bride she reported was the police chief. She escalated with lies, harassment, and false calls to every city department she could think of. But in the end, her obsession exposed her. The neighborhood saw the truth, and her power was gone. My wedding wasn't destroyed. It became stronger, because no matter how far she went, love and truth won in the end. And if you enjoyed this wild HOA showdown, make sure you subscribe for more unbelievable neighborhood stories. You won't believe what happens in the next one.